All right, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack what is honestly a fascinating historical and theological mystery presented in our source material. We are looking at this profound shift happening right now in modern religious communities, tracing an ancient timeline of empires and really analyzing the very words used to define a global faith. It's kind of like a giant puzzle that takes us all the way from ancient Mediterranean marketplaces straight into modern theological debates. And honestly, it might just completely reframe how you view religious identity today. So the source immediately hits us with a pretty high-stakes question, pointing out this modern trend where devout believers are just abandoning the very title that has defined their faith for millennia. It's a super provocative starting point. Why would people who actively follow Jesus want to drop the name that directly associates them with him? Is it just, a matter of semantics, or are there deeper historical and spiritual implications at play here? Let's find out. Section 1. The Modern Identity Crisis. Okay, the source breaks these modern objections down into 4 clear buckets. Pragmatically, some argue the term is barely even in the Bible. It appears only 3 times, so they suggest it wasn't really a divinely ordained label to begin with. Theologically, some feel claiming an exclusive title kind of misses the whole point. They believe the essence of faith is living a Christ-like life, not just wearing a label. Historically, people want to distance themselves from eras of oppression or even modern hypocrisy done under the banner of Christianity. And finally, as a matter of pure preference, a lot of folks are retreating to terms like disciple or follower of Christ or people of the way. But here's where the source challenges those alternative preferences head-on. The text argues that a vague term like disciple could historically apply to absolutely anyone. I mean, being a disciple literally just means being a student. And that leads us straight into the gritty reality of the ancient Mediterranean, where having a specific, undeniable identifier wasn't just some nice-to-have preference, it was an absolute necessity. Section 2. Apostles versus ancient sorcerers. You see, this historical dilemma was very, very real. The first century wasn't some quiet spiritual vacuum. It was incredibly crowded. The early church had to legally and socially distinguish its miracles and teachings from those of famous prophet-driven sorcerers. The source highlights figures like Simon the Sorcerer or a false prophet named Bar-Jesus. These guys had massive followings. We're talking whole towns under their spell. If you simply walked into a marketplace back then and called yourself a disciple, people would naturally ask, okay, a disciple of who? Simon the Sorcerer? To really give you a sense of the sheer scale of this spiritual economy, the source cites the book of Acts, pointing to the number 50,000. That was the staggering value in pieces of silver of the magic and witchcraft books burned by new converts in Ephesus alone. I mean, wow. That number proves just how lucrative, how widespread, and how culturally embedded these false prophets were. It was huge business. So, the absolutely crucial point here is that, contrary to the popular modern belief that outsiders or oppressors use the term Christian to mock them, the source argues the believers in Antioch actually labeled themselves. They desperately needed to establish a distinct identity. By calling themselves Christians, they essentially drew a hard line in the sand, making absolutely sure no one would mix them up with the followers of rival sorcerers or other religious factions. Section 3. The Conspiracy of Coin. Now, the source emphasizes that the early resistance actually did not come from the Roman Empire. Looking back at the trial of Jesus, the text highlights a quote from Pilate showing the Romans initially wanted absolutely nothing to do with this movement. The pushback was mostly local. It was driven by Jewish religious leaders who were trying to maintain their theological stronghold and keep public order. The Romans, at first, they just viewed it as an internal religious dispute and kind of ignored the whole thing. So, you're probably wondering, how did the mighty Roman Empire eventually get involved in violently persecuting Christians? Well, the source argues we basically need to follow the money. It points to this really cinematic moment in the book of Acts where the Apostle Paul casts a divining spirit out of a young damsel. Now, this girl had masters who were making an absolute fortune off her fortune-telling abilities. So when the spirit left, boom, so did their profit margin. And it was only after losing their profit that these angry masters dragged Paul and Silas to the local Roman magistrates. But listen to this. They didn't say, hey, these men cost us money. No. Instead, they completely twisted a financial loss into a fake political charge, claiming the believers were teaching unlawful customs and troubling the city. The source points out this was a highly calculated move. They weaponized the Roman government against the believers just to protect their own local financial interests. If we map this out on a timeline, the source's historical argument becomes super clear.
The text pushes back really hard against modern claims that the Roman Empire invented Christianity to control the masses. Actually, scratch that. It's the exact opposite. The Romans were manipulated into persecuting believers early on, and they spent nearly 3 centuries trying to suppress the movement. It wasn't until the Edict of Milan in 313 AD that Christianity was finally decriminalized, because, as the source argues, the movement had just grown way too large and resilient for the empire to stop.
Section 4. The Linguistic Decoder.
Okay, so let's get into the linguistics, because it all starts right here with the Hebrew concept of the Mashiach. Both the Jewish population and the early disciples thoroughly understood this concept. It referred to the prophesied king, the anointed one, detailed in ancient texts like the Book of Daniel. This was the specific, high-authority title that the religious leaders of the day were so terrified of.
And looking at the translation pipeline clears up so much modern confusion. Some critics love to claim the word Christ is an inaccurate translation or even some pagan invention, but the source stresses, no, this is just a standard linguistic translation. The Hebrew word Mashiach was translated into the Greek word Christos during the Hellenistic period, and then Christos is directly translated into the English word Christ. They all mean the exact same thing, the anointed one.
Understanding this translation process highlights exactly why dropping the title is, according to the text, a massive mistake. The source points out something pretty surprising. While Jesus, or Yeshua, was actually a really common first name in the ancient world, Christ is the specific, exclusive identifier of his divine authority. Claiming to follow just Jesus might not have been enough in the first century. You had to specify that you followed Jesus, the Christ.
Section 5. The Spiritual Consequences. The source firmly believes that the modern push to abandon the English translation Christian is not just some innocent matter of personal preference. Based on a quote from Acts 4:12, the text argues that the specific name and title hold the very core of salvation. In fact, the source goes as far as positing that the movement to drop the name is literally a deception orchestrated by Satan himself to suppress the very authority that grants salvation. To further cement how deeply tied the believers are to the title, the text points out that Jesus took attacks on his followers incredibly personally. When he confronted Saul, who, remember, was actively hunting down believers, Jesus didn't ask, "Hey, why are you persecuting my followers?" No, he asked, "Why persecutest thou me?" According to the source, this proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the believers and the name of Christ are inextricably linked. You simply cannot separate the church from the title of its founder.
Ultimately, the source leaves us with this really provocative thought to ponder. If the name Christian is stripped away, are believers risking historical and spiritual erasure? By trying to distance themselves from modern hypocrisy, are they accidentally denying the very title of the Anointed One? It is a fascinating look at how ancient history, marketplace economics, and language translation continue to shape powerful religious identities today. So, what do you think? Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.